Hello, everyone, and today I'm going to be reading from a book called The Fastest Boy in the World by Elizabeth Layard. In my dreams, I'm always running, running, running. Sometimes my feet fly over the ground, and I'm sure that if I could just go a little bit faster, I'd take off and fly like an eagle. Sometimes my legs feel as heavy as tree trunks, but I know that I must go on and reach the finishing line, whatever it costs. I've been running almost since I was a toddler. As soon as I could toddle, I'd stagger after my father as fast as my little legs would take me when he set out for the market on our donkey. "Solomon, come back," my mother would shout. I wouldn't listen, so she'd have to run after me, with me, snatch me up and laugh with me all the way home. That was how childhood began, and I can remember as clearly as anything the night when everything changed. I was 11 years old. At least I think I was 11. In the countryside in Ethiopia, nobody takes much notice of how old you are. It was the end of the day and the door of our house was firmly shut. It always made me shiver to think of the night outside, not just because it was dark and cold, but because there might be a hyena or two lurking in the darkness, or even worse, something demonish. I'll have to explain what our family home was like. In case you have never been to Ethiopia, it was round like most other people's houses up there in our cool highlands. And it had a thatched roof that went up to a point. There was only one room with the fire burning away in the middle. It got a bit smoky, but it kept us warm and gave a glowing light. There was a screen at one end, and our animals lived behind it. At night, that is. In the daytime, of course, they were out grazing. Anyway, that evening, Ma was stirring the pot of the stew that was cooking over the fire. The smell was so good it was making me feel very hungry. "How old am I, Ma?" I said suddenly. I don't know what put the idea into my head. "Let me see," she said vaguely, dropping another pinch of red-hot pepper into the pot. I could tell she wasn't listening. Abba, that's what we call my father, was listening though. He had just come in from his workout on our farm. He sat down on a little stool beside the fire, and I could see he was as hungry as I was. "You were born the year the harvest was so bad, and we had to borrow all that money from your uncle," he said. Ma looked reproachfully at him. Abba blinked and looked a bit guilty. "I wasn't thinking," he said quietly. "It was Helu who was born that year. Helu was my older brother, but he died when he was a little. Ma always sighs when anyone reminds her of him." Abba shot her an understanding look. Then he scratched his head. "Oh no, I remember now," he said. "You were born the year the magician came and turned my stick into a wand of gold." I loved it when Abba was in his teasing mode. Conjit, my little sister, had been picking up the unburnt ends of twigs and throwing them onto the fire while twisting a bit of hair over her forehead at the same time. She only ever seems to use one hand for anything useful. The other one is permanently fiddling with her hair. Now, though, she stopped for a whole long minute. "Oh," she said, her big brown eyes as round as the buttons on Grandfather's cotton jacket. "A gold wand? Where is it?" I nudged her, just to show that I knew she was being silly. Then I had to pull her upright in case she was toppled over into the fire. It turned back into a stick again, just like that, Abba said, giving me a sly look. Anyway, it wasn't that year. You were born just at the time when Twisty Horn had twins. Only they didn't turn out to be calves, but a couple of chickens. You should have seen them. They went flapping about all over the place. Everybody laughed, and even Grandfather, who had been sitting on the clay bench that ran right round the wall of the house, made a sort of rusty, wheezing sound that meant that he was laughing too. But Conjit didn't even smile. She looked quite shocked. "Cows can't have chickens for babies, Abba," she said seriously. "Everyone knows that." She falls for it every time. Just at that moment, a whiffling snort came from the stable behind the screen of sticks. I knew it was Twisty Horn and not Long Tail or Big Hoof. I know the sound of all our animals. I can tell our donkey, her name is a Lucky, from all the other donkeys at the market just by the way she brays. I know our 3 dogs too, of course, but they don't come into the house with us. Their job is to stay outside and guard our farm. They pretty much look after themselves. You're quite right, darling. Cows only have calves, said Abba, pulling Conjit sideways so that she could lean against his arm. I could tell his teasing mood was over. He was too tired for much when the evening came. He'd been out working all day on the farm. "Supper's ready," Ma said at last. She fetched out the big enamel tray and laid a huge round piece of pancake bread on it. "Our bread is called injera, and it's soft and thin and delicious." Then she scooped spoonfuls of stew from the pot and set them out in front of each of our places. Grandfather stood up and walked over to join us by the fire. I waited expectantly. 5, I said to myself. I counted the steps he was taking, and sure enough, his knees cracked like breaking sticks at the 5th step. I like doing that, guessing numbers, I mean. It's a private game I play with myself and with my friend Marcos when he's in the right mood. Grandfather sat down on the little stool that Abba had pulled up for him. "Solomon's 11, he said. I'd forgotten by now that I'd asked about my age. It was my job to take the bowl and the little jug of water round so that everyone could wash their hands before they ate. Yet I was too hungry to think about anything but food. No one said much while we were eating, but when we'd had enough, Grandfather sat back on his stool and said again, more thoughtfully this time, "Solomon's 11. I thought his mind was wandering, but it wasn't. He suddenly squared his shoulders, pulled the end of his thick white shawl away from his neck as if he was too hot, and said for the first time, 11, quite old enough. We'll go tomorrow." My parents went quiet. Ma froze with her hand halfway up to her mouth. Abba had pulled his little tooth cleaning stick from inside his pocket. From his inside pocket. He froze too. "Go where?" whispered Conjit. She didn't dare speak up in front of Grandfather. I knew she was burning to add, wherever it is, "Can I come too?" But she would never have been so disrespectful. I was glad she'd asked the question though, because I was burning to ask it too. "To Addis Ababa," said Grandfather, as casually as if he was talking about Kidame. our nearby town where I go to school, and Abba goes to the market on Thursdays. There's a man I need to see. Solomon can come with me. It's time he saw something of the world, and I might need him anyway. My heart had started pumping, and my face felt as if it was on fire. Addis Ababa, our capital city? Marcos's brother had been there once. He'd come home and told the most amazing stories about huge buildings with walls of glass and streets crowded with cars, and everyone wearing smart clothes and staircases that moved. I'd never been further than Kidame. It's all right, I suppose, but it's only a small town. It's got one big main street, which gets really muddy in the big rains. The bus comes through once a day, and cars sometimes too. It was about 5 miles to my school. I usually ran all the way there in the mornings because our teacher got furious if we were late. Then, of course, I had to run all the way home again in the afternoon. Only sometimes I walked the last bit. We weren't completely country bumpkins in Kidame. There was a shop in the main street, so that if people needed anything, they could buy it between Thursdays. Thursday was market day, and you could get practically anything in the market. There was electricity in Kidame too. Marcos and I used to creep up to the window, sometimes to watch it. And we usually got 5 or 10 minutes in before the barman came and shooed us away. Marcos even had electricity in his house. He could do his homework under a light in the evening, unlike me. Lucky him. I had to hold my books as near as I could to the fire. I could never see them very well, and they got all smudgy. If I held them too close, they even ended up singed. Marcos's house was near the pump too, where there was always running water. My mother had to fetch our water in a big heavy jar from the stream way down at the bottom of the hill every morning, with Conjit running after her, carrying her own little pot. Anyway, to get back to the story, Ma was still staring open-mouthed at grandfather. How long will you? She said to grandfather, looking pleadingly at him. It's a day's walk, grandfather said. We'll start tomorrow at sunup, and be there by sundown. You remember my nephew, Wandu? We'll stay 2 nights with him near Piazza. Then we'll get the bus back to Kidame the following morning. Now, no fuss, please. Solomon will be all right, and it's the school holidays at the moment, so he won't miss any lessons. I loved the way he talked in that casual, confident way about Piazza, wherever that was, and getting the bus home. A bus? I'd never been on a bus before. Abba was looking worried. It's years and years since you were last in Addis Ababa, Father, he said. How will you find your way? It's changed so much, I hear. And walking all that distance. That's why I need Solomon, grandfather said briskly. I'm not done yet. It's only 23 miles. I've walked a lot further than that in one day in my time. But I'd rather have company, and Solomon will do just fine. I don't remember the rest of the evening. Ma fussed about whether my shirt was clean. I only have one, apart from my school uniform. Then she worried about what we were going to eat on the journey. Grandfather didn't take any notice. He was looking pleased with himself. He stood up and went to lie down on the clay bench, folding his shawl over himself like a blanket. A minute later, he was asleep. Abba nodded at me to come and sit beside him. I hadn't expected this, Solomon, he said quietly, looking down into the still glowing heart of the fire. I'd planned to take you to Addis Ababa myself one of these days. Now you be careful. Your grandfather is an old man, and Addis Ababa is a very big city. He may not remember the way too well. Don't hurry or fuss him. Let him lean on you when he gets tired. And he felt inside the pocket of his tunic and brought out a little roll of tattered dollar bills. He peeled off a few of them and put them into my hand. For emergencies, he said. If your grandfather can't find his nephew, or if something goes wrong, you've got a little bit to help you out. Only if you really need it, mind. I know I can trust you not to lose it. I had never held so much money in my hand before. I felt quite frightened of it. There are thieves in Addis, Abba went on, looking serious. He nodded to Ma, who stood up and fetched down a little pouch from a shelf above the grain bins. Abba put the money in it and showed me how to hang it round my neck and keep it tucked inside my shirt. There, now mind you keep it safe, Ma said. Her forehead was creased up with worry. I knew it was me she was anxious about, more than the money, and it made me feel a bit worried too. The fire had died away to a few flames by the time we lay down that night. I stared up into the dim shadows flickering around the rafters. I was too excited to sleep. What would Marco say when I told him I'd been to Addis? He'd be sick with envy. But then my stomach jumped. What if I lost sight of grandfather in the busy streets among all the crowds of people? What if thieves attacked me and stole my money? I'll be really, really careful, I told myself. I'll look after grandfather really well. Then suddenly, I was asleep. Hope everybody enjoyed their break. And now, chapter 2. The rooster woke me up with his crowing. He sat right on top of the house every morning, making his racket. I usually slept through it and had to be shaken awake by Ma, But the rooster did his job that morning and woke me out of my sleep. Normally, I knew it was time to get up because of the chinks of daylight showing between the sticks in the walls of our house. But this morning it was still dark, so I could tell that it was very early. Ma was up though. She was leaning over the fire, blowing on the flames she had coaxed back to life. And the kettle was sitting on the hearthstones singing away. Ma, did I dream it? I said. Am I really going to Addis today? Yes, you are, she said grimly. And make sure you come home safe and sound. Grandfather had woken, by the way. Grandfather had woken by now. He made a sort of groaning noise, like he always did when he sat up in the morning. Then crossed himself and murmured a prayer. Come on, Wakeneshesh, he said to Mother. Where's my breakfast? We haven't got all day. Ma was ready for that. She poured a stream of golden liquid from the smoke-blackened kettle into a little glass and handed it to him. Grandfather sucked at it noisily. Ma gave me some too. Mind your manners in Addis Ababa, Solomon, she said. Don't let those smart city people think you come from a bad home. Be respectful. Don't speak unless you're spoken to, and don't gobble your food. That'll do, woman, said Grandfather. Leave the boy alone. We were off soon afterwards. Abba and Ma stood at the door of the house with Conjit between them to watch us go. It's one thing running by yourself along tracks you know so well that you could feel your way along them blindfold. It's quite another having to walk at the same speed as someone else, especially when that person is old. I knew every inch of the run into Kidame. I had my own counting games to help me make the miles go faster. I'd guess how many steps I'd need to get the tree at the corner of the lane and count the little brown birds sitting on the wall below the church. There were usually 4 or 5, and I'd never forgotten to touch the big stone at the bottom of the hill to keep evil away. I do it all at lightning speed. 2. Talking about running, I might as well explain that it was what I wanted to do more than anything else. Be a runner, I mean. Not just a boy who ran to school and back every day. I wanted to run in big races in other countries and bring glory to Ethiopia and make everyone in Kidame think I was a hero. I wanted to be the fastest runner in the world. In Ethiopia, even the little kids in country places know about our famous Ethiopian runners. They're the best, world champions, marathons, the Olympic Games. They win medals wherever they go. I knew you had to be super special to be a runner. You had to train and train and train and run and run and run. You had to start really young. But I did run and run. And as I explained before, I started as soon as I could walk. I just didn't know how to train. 4. Bekoji. It's only half a day on the bus from Kidame. Children go there to learn to run. I wanted desperately to go to that school. I'd never dared to tell Abba about wanting to be a runner. I knew he'd say no because he needed me on the farm. But he couldn't stop me dreaming. No one can stop a person dreaming. Anyway, there was no point in thinking about running while I was with Grandfather. He plodded along so slowly, that I was burning with impatience. I was desperate to get past Kidame and on to see places I'd never been to before, along the road to Addis Ababa. At first, I kept running ahead. Then I'd have to stop and wait for grandfather to catch up with me. He got irritated after a while. For God's sake, for goodness sake, Solomon, he said, you're dancing about as if you've been stung by a bee. Calm down. Keep to the same pace, nice and steady, or you'll be exhausted before we get halfway. He was right, I suppose, but it took an age for us to get to Kidame. And even when we got there, grandfather was in no hurry. He walked down the main street greeting all the older men he met, all his friends, and telling them he was off to Addis. At least it gave me the chance to do a bit of bragging myself. And by the time we were ready to walk out of town, 4 or 5 boys from my school were there to wave me off, calling out silly things like, bring me back a TV set. Make sure you get to watch a football match. Hop on a plane to America while you're about it. Why don't you? Just as we were leaving town, Marcos came running after me. I've just heard, Solomon. They're flying back home today. They're landing in Addis tomorrow. You might see them. Oh, I wish I was coming with you. At least, I think that's what he was saying. Only he was so excited and talking so fast that it sounded like air, fly, add, tomorrow. See, I wish. I stared at him and said, I don't know what you're talking about, you big idiot. So he said it all again, and I got it this time. You mean the athletes, the runners from the Olympics? Yes. My heart gave a great kick. Our national heroes, Haile Gabriel Selassie, Deratu Tulu. I might really see them in person. I'd always imagined that the land beyond the hills on the far side of Kidame would be different and exciting, but it wasn't like that at all. Everywhere looked like home. In fact, with little farmhouses dotted about among the fields, and a few trees, and the occasional round church with a tin roof and a cross on the top. By the time the sun was overhead, we must have walked for about 10 miles, and it was really hot. My legs were beginning to ache. Grandfather was right about going slow and steady, I told myself. Just when I thought I'd never be able to make it all the way, grandfather said, we'll take a break in the next town and have something to eat. I won't go on about the rest of the journey, just to say that it seemed to last forever. 23 miles is a no short stroll after all. After a long time, the dirt road ended and we were walking along on smooth black stuff that grandfather called tarmac. There was more traffic now. Trucks came thundering up behind us, blaring their horns, and once or twice a lumbering old bus roared past, puffing out choking black smoke from its rear end. Every time we passed some houses, I'd say, is this it, grandfather? Is this Addis Ababa? And he'd say, this little village? Of course it isn't, you silly boy. Addis is much bigger than this. I didn't need to ask him when we got there at last. We were suddenly walking between big buildings with glass windows that shone like fire in the setting sun. There were people everywhere, hurrying along the rough, stony ground at the side of the tarmac. There were rows of shops with signs outside them, some with meat hanging from hooks in the windows, some with piles of fruit in stands outside. In Kidame, everyone knows everyone else, more or less. But in Addis, people didn't stop to greet each other. They just rushed past. I'd been so busy staring around at everything that I'd hardly noticed that we'd slowed right down. Grandfather had put his hand on my shoulder a while ago, and now I began to realize that he was leaning on me quite heavily. I looked up into his face and saw with a shock that it had gone a sort of gray color. His lips were clamped tightly shut. "Are you all right, Grandfather?" I asked him. He grunted. "Of course I am. Don't be cheeky." I wasn't being cheeky, and we both knew it. I was dog-tired myself, but now I was getting worried about Grandfather. What would I do if he stopped walking and couldn't go on? I didn't have time to think much because a big truck was carrying down the road towards us. The roar of its engine was so loud that it blocked the sound of all the other traffic. So I didn't hear the other truck coming up behind us until it let out a deafening blast on its horn. I turned to look and saw that it was racing along half of the road and coming straight for us, trying to give room for the oncoming truck to pass. Grandfather was right in its path. "Grandfather, look out!" I shouted. He didn't seem to hear me. I grabbed his arm and pulled him sideways. He fell to the ground with a crash. The truck roared past with another rude blast of its horn. Its wheels were only centimeters away from Grandfather's legs. I squatted down beside him. I was afraid that he would be furious with me for pulling him over, but he didn't seem to notice that I was there. He was half sitting, half lying, and looked dazed. "Are you hurt, Grandfather? Did it hit you? The truck?" He stared back at me, but he didn't say anything. "Grandfather!" My voice was rising. I was starting to feel panicky. Then he shook himself and said in his usual grumbling voice, "Not hit. No need to knock me down, though." I grinned, relieved. It was great to hear him speak, even though he was cross with me. "Can you get up?" I put my hand under his elbow. Yes, I don't need you," he said irritably. A little crowd of people had gathered. A man bent down and helped Grandfather to his feet. "The truck driver," he said. "Outrageous. They think they own the place. Could have been a nasty accident." Grandfather tried to speak, but he seemed to be having trouble staying upright. A woman came up and took his arm. "Come on over here, Uncle," she said. "You can sit down for a minute. Get your breath back." He took his arm and led him away from the road towards a little shop. A white plastic chair was set outside it. Against the wall. A young man was sitting on it, sliding a string of beads backwards and forwards between his fingers. The woman scowled at him and he stood up. Grandfather sank into the chair. "Have you come far?" the woman asked me. The old man looks done in. From Kidame, I spoke as quietly as I could to be polite, but I must have been too quiet. Never heard of it, she said. Where are you going now? My grandfather has a friend in a place called Piazza, I said, a bit louder. I felt shy. I wasn't used to being with strangers. The people around me were talking fast in a strange accent, rattling along in a way I could barely understand. I stood like a block, afraid that I was looking stupid and ignorant. Piazza, the man who had given grandfather his chair, laughed. That's right in the middle of town. You'd better get walking again, son, if you want to be there before midnight. The woman clucked at him. Don't be so hard hearted, Yusuf. Can't you see the poor old man's exhausted? Walking all day, then practically run over, with only a child to help him. They should take the minibus. One'll be along in a minute. A bus? The thought of it scared me. How could I even find the right bus? How much would a ride on it cost? Was this the kind of emergency Abba had meant? And how would we know where to get off? The woman seemed to read my thoughts. First time in the city, are you? I know what that's like. I come from the country myself. Don't worry, dear. The bus only costs a few cents, and everyone gets off at Piazza. You can't go wrong. Yusuf will take you to the bus stop and help you get on it. She turned on the man with a ferocious scowl. Stop looking so grumpy, you big lump, she barked at him. You've been sitting on that chair doing nothing all afternoon. Make yourself useful for once. My mouth fell open. I'd never heard a woman talk to a man like that before. Was that what people did in Addis Ababa? I nearly said, thank you very much, ma'am, but we'll walk. I'm sure my grandfather will be all right in a minute. But when I looked at grandfather, I could see that he wasn't all right at all. What shall we do, grandfather? I whispered to him. She says we ought to go on a bus. He licked his dry lips and nodded. Bus, he croaked. The woman had disappeared inside. She came out again with a glass of water. Here, drink this, uncle, she said. It'll make you feel better. And she was right. Because when grandfather had gulped the water down, he looked more like his old self. He got to his feet, leaned on his stick, gripping the top of it so hard that his knuckles went pale, made a little bow, then began a speech of thanks. She cut him short. Yes, well, it's nothing. We're all God's children. Get on now with Yusuf. He'll show you where the bus stops and put you on it. You take care of your grandfather, young man. No more long walks for a day or two, eh? Okay, everybody, thank you, and I'll see you when I begin Chapter 3. Thank you.